She was 25 when Marcus Flynn filed. It wasn't a filing so much as a clean digital severance, a surgical removal. She found out when her keycard failed to open the lobby door to their apartment building. She found out again when her physical key scraped uselessly against the new, high-security lock on their fourth-floor apartment door. He had left her bags on the doorstep, 2 suitcases and her engineering field bag. Taped to the largest suitcase was a stiff manila envelope. Inside was a letter from a solicitor she had never heard of, outlining in cold, numbered points the dissolution of their shared assets. He took the accounts. He took the investment portfolios. He took the Scandinavian minimalist furniture they had spent months choosing, each piece a testament to his clean, quantifiable aesthetic. He took the art prints, the German kitchen appliances, the lease itself, which was now solely in his name. He had been methodical. He had been thorough. He had taken everything he could count, everything with a documented market value. He had left her with the contents of her suitcases and the 312 euros in her personal wallet. He had never once, in their 3 years together, asked about the crumbling stone building in County Clare her grandmother had left her. It was an unlisted asset, a line item with no value in the world he inhabited. She had grown up understanding metal, the way some children grow up understanding silence. It was a language spoken in the family, a deep, resonant grammar of heat and force. She understood the particular quality of iron drawn from the bog, its stubborn, fibrous nature. She knew the song of steel under a hammer, the high, clear ring that signaled its temper was true. This knowledge was not learned from textbooks, though she had read them all, but absorbed through the skin, through the air of her grandmother's forge. It was a kind of inheritance that could not be written down, a cellular memory that lived in the palms of her hands and the base of her spine. It was the quiet legacy of the Brennans, a lineage not of lords or scholars, but of smiths who knew the secret heart of the fire and the slow, patient will of the stone. For generations they had shaped the raw material of the earth into things of use and beauty, their lives measured not in years, but in the rhythmic exhalation of the bellows and the steady, percussive fall of the hammer. This was the world she came from, a world of tangible things, of soot and sweat, and the immense, grounding weight of the anvil. Her grandmother, Brigid, had been the forge itself, or so it had seemed to Saoirse as a child. She was a woman who seemed forged from the same elements she commanded, with a spine of straight-grained steel and a quiet, steady warmth that emanated from her like heat from cooling iron. Brigid had taken over the forge not by choice, but by necessity, after Saoirse's grandfather, Seamus, had been taken by a sudden fever in the damp winter of 1978, leaving her a widow at 32 with 2 young sons. The men in the village had offered their condolences and their quiet, pitying assumption that the forge would now go cold. A woman had no place at the anvil, they said, not with that kind of fire, that kind of labor. Brigid had listened to them all, her face as still and unreadable as a cold hearth. She had served them tea and thanked them for their concern. Then, the morning after the funeral, she had walked into the forge, tied on her husband's heavy leather apron, which hung on her small frame like armor, and lit the fire. She did not light it tentatively. She lit it with the same sure, practiced motions she used to knead bread, a fundamental act of creation and sustenance. She knew the precise way to stack the coal, how to coax the first reluctant flames into a breathing, hungry heart. The work that followed was her answer to their pity, her rebuttal to their assumptions. She repaired the tines on their hay forks, straightened the axles of their trailers, and forged new hinges for their gates, her work stronger and truer than her husband's had ever been. She did not work with brute force, but with an engineer's understanding of stress and temperature, a knowledge of when to strike and when to wait, when to quench and when to anneal. She had overcome their skepticism not with words, but with the undeniable evidence of her competence, with objects that held their edge, bore their load, and swung true. The forge in her hands was not just a place of business. It was a declaration of resilience. She had acquired it through marriage, but she had earned it through loss, and she kept it alive through sheer, unyielding will, a testament to the idea that true strength was not about the power to strike, but the endurance to stand one's ground. Saoirse's childhood summers were measured in the scent of burning coal and hot metal. While other children went to the seaside, she was sent to her grandmother in Clare, to a world that felt ancient and elemental. Brigid never sat her down for formal lessons. The teaching was osmotic, a slow infusion of knowledge that happened while Saoirse swept the stone floor, or pumped the great sighing bellows, or watched, mesmerized, as a straight bar of iron was coaxed into a perfect, lyrical spiral. She learned the different colors of the fire, the cherry red of forging heat, the bright lemon yellow of welding temperature, the soft blood orange glow that was perfect for annealing. She learned the feel of different hammers, the authoritative weight of the sledge, the delicate touch of the crosspeen. Brigid would speak to her not in instructions, but in observations. "The steel is telling you it's ready," she would murmur, her eyes fixed on the glowing metal in the coals. "Listen to it." And Saoirse would listen, and she would begin to understand that silent language. It was in this dusty, firelit space that she first understood the principles of material science, the way stress and heat could transform a substance, making it either brittle or strong. This understanding guided her to her degree in structural materials engineering, a modern, academic version of her grandmother's intuitive craft. She met Marcus at a university recruitment fair. He was a venture capital analyst, even then, sharp-suited and sharper-eyed, looking for nascent genius to fund. He was attentive in the specific way that lonely people find irresistible, his focus a narrow, intense beam that made her feel seen, analyzed, and deeply understood. He was fascinated by her mind, by the way she could explain the crystalline structure of alloys, the tensile strength of composites. He saw her intellect as a valuable asset, a thing to be acquired and polished. Their life together in Dublin was a construct of his design. Clean lines, efficient systems, a quiet, orderly existence where every object and every moment was optimized for value. He loved her competence, her quiet self-sufficiency, but he never understood its source. Once, early in their relationship, she had tried to explain the forge, showing him a faded photograph of Brigid at the anvil, sparks flying around her like fireflies. He had looked at the image with a kind of detached curiosity. A romantic fantasy, he had called it, smiling. "Lovely, but there's no economic future in that kind of thing. It's a relic." She had felt a cold, quiet shudder fall inside her. In that moment, she understood the profound and unbridgeable gap between them. His world was one of numbers on a screen, of abstract value and projected growth. Her world, the world that had formed her, was one of stone and fire and iron, of things that endured. The marriage, as the solicitor's letter termed their cohabitation, had failed because he had only ever seen a fraction of her. He saw the engineer, the quantifiable asset. He never saw the smith's granddaughter. He had catalogued her skills, but he had never once asked about her soul. The bus ride to Ennis was a long, gray blur of rain-streaked windows and the low hum of the engine. Saoirse sat with her field bag on her lap, its familiar weight a small, solid comfort. Inside were her calipers, her material samples, her notebooks filled with calculations, the tools of her trade. They felt like the only part of her Dublin life that was truly hers. From Ennis, she took a local bus that wound its way deeper into the countryside, the roads narrowing, the green of the fields becoming more intense, broken by the dark, skeletal lines of stone walls. The air that hissed through the window vents changed, losing the city's sharp, exhaust-laden edge and taking on the soft, damp scent of earth and peat and rain. She got off at a crossroads marked only by a weathered pub and a small, whitewashed post office. The solicitor's office was a short walk away, above a quiet bakery. Mr. O'Malley was a man who seemed to be made of tweed and soft, papery skin. He had known her grandmother well, and his eyes, magnified by thick glasses, held a genuine warmth that felt like the first ray of sun after a long winter. He handled the paperwork with a gentle, unhurried efficiency, his movements slow and deliberate. He spoke of Bridget not as a client, but as a force of nature. "A remarkable woman," he said, stamping the final document. "She had a spine on her like a length of rebar. The whole county knew it." He didn't ask about Dublin or why Saoirse was there with only 2 suitcases. He seemed to understand that some things did not need to be spoken aloud. He reached into a drawer of his heavy oak desk and pulled out a key. It was not a modern key of polished brass, but a large, heavy thing of forged iron, its surface pitted and dark with age. The bit was complex, the shaft thick and satisfyingly solid in her hand. "She left this here for you," Mr. O'Malley said, placing it in her palm. "Said you'd know what to do with it when the time came." The weight of the key was the weight of her entire history. It was a physical link to the past, a solid piece of her grandmother's world. She walked the half-mile to the forge, the lane growing rougher, the hedges closing in. And then she saw it. It sat low against the gray sky, a simple, rectangular building of dark, lichen-spotted stone, its slate roof sagging in the middle like a tired old horse. The paint on the great double doors had long since peeled away, leaving the wood bare and silvered by the weather. A tangle of ivy crept up one corner, its green fingers probing the mortar between the stones. It was dilapidated. It was neglected. But as she stood there, key in hand, she saw what Marcus never could have. She saw the good bones. The stonework was immense, solid, laid by hands that understood gravity and time. The massive lintel above the doors was a single, heroic block of granite. The structure was sound. It had stood for over 150 years, weathering Atlantic gales and changing fortunes. It was not a ruin, it was dormant. It was waiting. She fitted the iron key into the huge, rusted lock. It took both hands and all her strength to turn it, the mechanism groaning in protest after years of silence. The bolt shot back with a deafening clang that echoed in the quiet afternoon. She pulled one of the heavy doors open, and the smell rolled out to meet her, a smell of cold soot, damp earth, and the faint metallic ghost of a long-dead fire. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the open door and a single grime-covered window high on the back wall. Dust motes danced in the slanted shaft of gray light like a galaxy of tiny stars. It was exactly as she remembered it, only colder, quieter, shrouded in the dust of the 4 years since Bridget's death. The great stone forge dominated the center of the room, its chimney rising like a black pillar to the rafters. The anvil, a massive block of steel with a proud, elegant horn, sat on its stump of oak, its surface coated in a fine layer of rust-colored dust. The bellows, a huge leathery lung, was slumped and silent. Racks of tools lined the walls, tongs of every conceivable size and shape, hammers with faces worn smooth by a century of use, files and rasps and chisels, all sleeping under a blanket of gray. It was a cathedral of forgotten work. She walked to the hearth, the heart of the space. It was cold, filled with the pale, skeletal ashes of the last fire her grandmother had ever built. She ran her hand along the rough stone of the chimney breast, feeling the chill of it seep into her fingers. And then she remembered. A story Bridget had told her once, a quiet comment made on a rainy afternoon. "A good smith always has a secret," she'd said, tapping a loose stone just to the left of the main opening, a stone indistinguishable from its neighbors. "Something tucked away for a hard winter." Saoirse's heart began to beat a little faster. She knelt on the dusty floor and examined the stones. She pushed and prodded, her engineer's mind analyzing the pattern, looking for the anomaly. And there it was, a single stone, set just slightly deeper than the others, with a faint, almost invisible seam of crumbling mortar around it. She used the tip of a small, discarded file to scrape away the old mortar. It came away easily, dissolving into dust. She worked her fingers into the crack and pulled. The stone resisted for a moment, then came free with a low, grating sound, revealing a dark, rectangular cavity within the massive chimney structure. Inside, nestled in the darkness, was a small, heavy box made of riveted iron plate. It was a strong box, simple and brutally functional, clearly made by hand on the very anvil that stood a few feet away. It was sealed not with a lock, but with two small, neat welds at the seams. It was her grandmother's work. She recognized the particular clean pattern of the weld bead. On top of the box lay a folded piece of paper, thick and slightly yellowed. She lifted the paper out first. It was heavy, with a fibrous, handmade texture, forge paper, made for sketching out designs, tough enough to withstand the grime of the workshop. The handwriting was her grandmother's, a strong, clear cursive that leaned ever so slightly to the right. The ink was faded but perfectly legible. She unfolded it carefully. It was a letter. "My Serge," it began. "If you are reading this, then the time has come, and you have need of this place. I am sorry I am not there to put the kettle on for you. Do not grieve for the cold hearth. A fire is only ever sleeping. You have our hands, girl. You know how to wake it up. This forge is your blood right. It is not land or money in a bank. It is a place to stand your ground. It is a place to make things right again. Inside this box is what I could save over the years. Not a fortune, but enough. Enough for a new roof. Enough for a load of coal. Enough to begin again. Use it well. Declan Walsh is the man for the slates. He is an honest man, and his father worked with your great-grandfather. Tell him Bridget sent you. He will see you right. The rest is up to you. Remember what I told you. The strength is not in the hammer. It is in the hand that holds it. It is in the eye that sees the shape of the thing before it is made. You have the eye for it. You always did. Do not let anyone ever tell you that what you can make with your own two hands is worthless. It is the only thing that is truly yours. Now get to work. Love, your Nana Bridget." Tears she hadn't known were there blurred the words. It was her grandmother's voice, direct, unsentimental, and profoundly kind. It was validation. It was instruction. It was a map for the future. She wiped her eyes on the dusty sleeve of her jacket and turned her attention to the box. She found a cold chisel and a heavy hammer on a nearby rack, their handles feeling impossibly familiar in her grip. She placed the chisel on the welded seam and struck it once, hard and true. The sound was a sharp, clear crack that shattered the years of silence. The weld broke clean. She did the same on the other side. The lid was free. She lifted it. Inside, nestled in oilcloth, were thick, tightly bound bundles of old paper currency, punts, not euros, and dozens of heavy, gleaming gold sovereigns, their milled edges catching the faint light. She sat back on her heels, the cold of the stone floor seeping into her jeans. She didn't count it immediately. She just looked at it, this secret hoard, this legacy of a woman's quiet, lifelong thrift. It was, as the letter had promised, not a fortune. But it was enough. It was the material manifestation of her grandmother's resilience, a tangible store of perseverance. It was the capital for a new life, a life she would build with her own two hands. The first and most urgent task was the roof. The sag in the center was a clear sign of rot in the main beam, and several slates were missing, leaving dark, damp patches on the rafters below. The next morning, she walked into the village and found the small, unassuming yard of Walsh and Son, roofing. Declan Walsh was a man in his late 50s with kind eyes and hands as gnarled and strong as old tree roots. When she introduced herself and said the name Bridget Brennan, his face broke into a wide, genuine smile. "Bridget's granddaughter," he said, his voice a warm County Clare burr. "I'll be damned. I haven't seen you since you were a little thing, trailing after her in a pair of wellies too big for you. Your grandmother was one of a kind. She forged the gates for my own house, you know. They'll still be standing when the house itself is dust." He came to the forge that afternoon. He walked the roof, his movements deft and certain, and assessed the damage with a practiced eye. He quoted her a price that she knew, from her own engineering background, was more than fair. He was seeing her right, just as Bridget had known he would. The work began the following Monday. Declan and his son, a quiet young man named Liam, arrived with a lorry full of new Welsh slates and a massive length of seasoned Irish oak for the new ridge beam. Saoirse did not retreat into the small cottage next door that her grandmother had also left her. Instead, she was out there with them, every day, from the damp, misty dawn until the light failed in the late afternoon. She wasn't just making tea. She was on the scaffolding, learning how to strip the old, broken slates, her gloved hands prying at the rusted nails. She helped them rig the block and tackle to hoist the new beam into place, her knowledge of physics and load-bearing capacities proving unexpectedly useful. Declan, initially surprised, quickly came to respect her quiet competence. He showed her how to mix the lime mortar, the proper consistency for bedding the ridge tiles. He taught her how to cut the slates with a slater's hammer, a precise, expert flick of the wrist that took her days to master. She absorbed it all, finding a deep, rhythmic satisfaction in the physical labor. The ache in her shoulders at the end of the day was a clean, honest pain, a feeling of accomplishment that was more real than any success she had ever had in her Dublin office. She was not just repairing a roof. She was rebuilding her own foundations, one slate, one nail, one measured movement at a time. The community of 2 men and 1 woman, working together under the vast, shifting Clare sky, became a small world of shared purpose. They worked through drizzle and wind, their conversations brief and practical, punctuated by the sharp tap of hammers and the scrape of slate on wood. Once the roof was sound, a solid, dark gray shield against the Atlantic rains, Saoirse turned her attention to the interior. This was work she could do alone. It was a slow, methodical process of reclamation. She started with light and air, scrubbing the years of grime from the high window until clear, unfiltered daylight could pour in, illuminating the cavernous space. She opened the great doors wide each morning, letting the fresh, damp air chase out the stale ghosts of neglect. Then came the cleaning. For weeks she swept and scraped, removing layers of dust and soot that seemed to contain the very memory of time. The stone floors, once a uniform gray, revealed shades of brown and green and quartz-flecked black. She cleaned every tool on the racks, using wire brushes and oil to scour away the rust, feeling the maker's marks under her fingers, the subtle balance of a well-made hammer, the perfect curve of a pair of tongs. She was not just cleaning them. She was reawakening them, honoring the hands that had used them before her. The great bellows was her biggest challenge. The leather was dry and cracked. She spent a week treating it, rubbing it down with neat's foot oil, her hands working the suppleness back into the old hide, stitch by stitch. When she finally pumped the great handle, the bellows let out a long, deep sigh, a breath held for 4 years, and a small puff of dust and life came from its nozzle. The forge was breathing again. She set up a small corner for herself, a space to live within the larger workshop. She brought in a bed, a small table, a chair, and a camping stove. It was Spartan, but it was hers. She ate her simple meals listening to the rain on the new roof, the sound a comforting drumbeat of security. The space was transforming. It was no longer a dusty mausoleum. It was becoming a home, With the forge secured and a basic living space established, the money from the strongbox was beginning to run low. She needed to find work, a way to sustain herself and fund the next phase of her project, bringing fire back to the hearth. She found it in the nearby town of Kilrush, in a small engineering consultancy that specialized in the restoration of historic buildings. The firm was run by a woman named Fiona Daly, an architect with a fierce passion for vernacular Irish architecture. During the interview, Fiona looked over Saoirse's pristine university credentials with interest, but it was when Saoirse mentioned where she was living that Fiona's eyes lit up with recognition. "Bridget Brennan's forge?" she said. "I knew your grandmother. I consulted with her once on the ironwork for the restoration of the old courthouse. She was a master, an artist with a mind for physics. She could look at a drawing for a gate and tell you exactly where it would fail in 100 years. She had the eye." Saoirse was hired on the spot, offered a part-time contract to consult on material analysis for their projects. The work was a perfect fit, a bridge between her formal education and her inherited knowledge. She would analyze samples of old mortar, assess the structural integrity of ancient timbers, and specify modern materials that were sympathetic to the old. Her supervisor, Fiona, who had known and deeply respected her ancestor, treated her not as a junior employee but as a colleague, a peer who carried a valuable legacy. The job gave her an income, but it also gave her something more, a professional connection to the community, a validation of her skills that was rooted in the respect her family had earned over generations. On her days off, she did not rest. Those days were for the forge. Her personal project was not grand or ambitious. It was simply to learn, to practice, to reclaim the skills that had lain dormant in her hands since childhood. She began by lighting the fire. It took her 3 attempts to get it right, to build the careful mound of coke, to coax the flame with the bellows until it roared into a solid, glowing heart of heat. The first time the fire truly caught, the orange glow pushing back the shadows, she felt a thrill that was primal and profound. She was the 3rd generation of her family to light a fire in this very hearth. She started with the simplest of exercises, the ones Bridget had taught her all those years ago. She took a length of mild steel bar and practiced drawing it out, hammering it longer and thinner, learning to control the movement of the metal under the hammer. She practiced upsetting, making the bar shorter and thicker. She practiced bending, twisting, punching holes. Her first attempts were clumsy, the marks of her hammer uneven. But with each session, her rhythm improved. Her arm, strengthened by the work on the roof, learned the familiar swing. Her eye learned to read the color of the heat with more accuracy. She forged simple things: a poker for the fire, a set of hooks to hang tools, a small, elegant, leaf-shaped finial for a gatepost, just for the beauty of it. Each object was a lesson. Each mistake was a teacher. She was not producing goods for sale. She was engaged in a deep, meditative conversation with the metal, with the fire, and with the ghost of her grandmother. Word of her work spread through the quiet, interconnected network of the local community. People who had known her family began to visit, drawn by curiosity and a sense of history reawakening. An old farmer named Colum stopped by one afternoon, his hands clasped behind his back, and watched her work for a silent 10 minutes before speaking. "Your grandmother mended the plow for my father," he said, his voice raspy. "She did it in an afternoon when no one else would touch it. Saved our harvest that year." A woman who ran a local art gallery came by, fascinated by the sculptural forms of the old tools and the raw, elemental nature of the work. She brought Saoirse a flask of hot soup and a loaf of bread, and they talked for an hour about the beauty of functional objects. These visits were small, quiet affirmations. Each story shared about Bridget was a piece of her grandmother given back to her. They were not just neighbors. They were the custodians of her family's reputation, a living archive of the respect Bridget had earned. They saw her not as an outsider, a refugee from the city, but as a rightful heir, a Brennan who had come home to take up her place. Their acceptance was a quiet, steadying presence, weaving her back into the fabric of the place her family had helped to build. She was no longer just a resident of the forge. She was becoming part of its living history, the next link in a chain forged in fire and time. He arrived on a wet October morning. The sky was a low, bruised purple, and a fine, persistent mist was falling, turning the lane to mud and beating on the cold iron of the tools hanging by the door. Saoirse was at the anvil, the forge fire roaring, the rhythmic, steady clang of her hammer on hot steel, the only sound besides the hiss of the rain. She was working on a commission, her first real one, a set of complex, decorative hinges for the doors of a restored church, a project Fiona had passed on to her. She was so absorbed in the work, in the delicate process of shaping a glowing scroll, that she didn't hear the car until it was already stopped. It was a sleek, black German saloon, its polished finish utterly alien in the rustic lane, already speckled with mud. The driver's door opened and Marcus Flynn stepped out. He was dressed for a meeting in the city, a tailored charcoal overcoat, a crisp white shirt, and expensive leather shoes that were immediately ruined by the muddy ground. He stood for a moment, looking at the scene before him with an expression of profound bewilderment. He saw the new roof, the clean, organized yard, the smoke pluming from the chimney. He saw the open doors of the forge, the roaring fire inside, and he saw her. He saw Saoirse, her face smudged with soot, her hair tied back, a heavy leather apron covering her clothes, her arm rising and falling with a strength and certainty he had never witnessed. She finished the heat, hammering the scroll into its final, perfect curve before quenching it with a great hiss of steam in the slack tub. Only then did she turn to face him, placing the hammer on the face of the anvil. Her silence held all the power. He was the one who had to speak, to bridge the immense distance that now separated them. "Saoirse," he said, his voice sounding thin and reedy in the open air. He took a hesitant step forward, wincing as his shoe sank into the soft earth. I didn't know about this place." He gestured vaguely at the forge, at her, at the whole, solid, irrefutable reality of it. "When we settled the assets, this was not on any of the documentation. I tried to be thorough, but this was not accounted for." It was a confession, not of wrongdoing, but of a professional oversight. He had missed an asset. That was what bothered him. The dawning awareness in his eyes was not of her resilience, but of his own failure to properly quantify her. He looked at the solid stone building, at the plumes of valuable heat rising from the chimney, and he was, for the first time, doing the math. She picked up a new length of steel with her tongs and placed it into the heart of the fire, then turned to the bellows, giving the handle a long, slow pull. The fire roared, showering the dark space with a fresh cascade of golden sparks. She did not look at him. She looked at the fire, at the metal beginning to glow. He took another step, his composure fraying. "I was in the area," he said, a lie so transparent it was almost pitiful. "I thought I would see how you were." He looked from her soot-streaked face to the clean, powerful lines of the anvil. Is there anything that can be repaired?" he asked, the word hanging in the air between them, loaded with a meaning he intended and a dozen others he could not comprehend. Saoirse stopped pumping the bellows. She turned her head slowly and looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. She saw a man in an expensive coat, shivering slightly in the damp air, a man completely out of his element, a visitor from a world of sterile surfaces and digital transactions. "You never asked about my grandmother," she said, her voice quiet, calm, and utterly devoid of anger. It was a simple statement of fact. "In 3 years, you never once asked her name." He had no answer. There was nothing to say. He looked down at his ruined shoes, then back at her. The finality was in her posture, in the steady gaze of her eyes. She offered him nothing, no anger, no recrimination, not even the satisfaction of a fight. She offered him only the quiet, unassailable truth of his own omission. He seemed to shrink a little inside his expensive coat. The confident, analytical man she had known was gone, replaced by someone small and confused. He had come expecting… what? Tears? A plea for help? A ruin he could perhaps condescend to salvage? He had found a kingdom he didn't know existed, and a queen who had no need of him. He nodded once, a short, jerky motion. "Right," he muttered to himself. "Of course." He turned and walked back to his pristine car, leaving a trail of deep, muddy footprints. He got in, started the engine, and drove away, the sound of the powerful motor quickly swallowed by the damp Irish air. Saoirse watched until the car was gone. Then she turned back to the forge, took the glowing iron from the fire, and laid it on the anvil. She lifted her hammer, and the clear, ringing sound of steel on steel filled the lane once more. The work continued. That night, after the fire was banked and the tools were cleaned and put away, Saoirse did not go to her bed. She pulled up an old wooden stool and sat before the great stone hearth. The main fire was out, but the deep bed of coke held a residual breathing heat. A constellation of red and orange embers pulsed softly in the darkness, a slow, fading heartbeat at the center of the forge. She sat in the encompassing silence, a silence made deeper by the memory of the day's ringing hammer blows. She thought of the generations of her family who had stood on this very spot, their lives intertwined with the fire and the iron. She thought of her great-grandfather, who had built the forge, and her grandfather, Seamus, whose time here had been cut short. And she thought of Brigid, a woman made of quiet resilience, who had taken up the hammer out of necessity and turned it into an act of creation and defiance. She had inherited more than a building and a box of money. She had been given a place to stand, a set of tools, and a purpose. It was an inheritance of strength, a legacy of self-sufficiency that could never be quantified on a spreadsheet or liquidated in a settlement. She thought about Marcus, a man who navigated the world by numbers, who saw life as a series of transactions. He had looked at her and seen a collection of assets to be managed. He had measured her worth by her degree, her salary, her contribution to their shared portfolio. He had been unable to see the part of her that was forged in this place, the part of her that knew how to take something raw and unformed and give it shape and strength. His worldview was so narrow, so impoverished by its insistence on monetary value, that he had been blind to the only real treasure she possessed. He had stripped their apartment of every object he deemed valuable, every item with a price tag, and in his meticulous, thorough accounting, he had overlooked the one thing that was truly priceless. He had left her with the source of her power. Marcus Flynn had taken everything he could document. He had taken the furniture he could sell, the accounts he could liquidate, the art he could appraise. He took the clean, orderly life he had built, a life of calculated returns and managed risk. He had left behind the only thing that mattered, the one thing whose value he was incapable of comprehending. He forgot the crumbling blacksmith shop her grandmother left. It was the best thing he ever forgot.